Welcome to Lectionary Call-In for Tuesday, June 7th of 2022, where two laypersons, a pastor, and an academician gather for about 45 to 50 minutes each week to discuss the Gospel Lectionary for the coming Sunday. This Sunday is June 12th. Each Tuesday we call in from wherever we may be at 6:30 a.m. Eastern Time. And for our friend in Charles Willard in Minnesota, that's 5:30 a.m. Thank you, Charles. Our little team's working to be faithful to Lectionary Year C, and that puts us in the Gospel of John on Sunday. We hope this discussion will provide areas of focus and reflection, and here's how it works. We develop perspectives independently. After the lead-off, we share some formative questions, and then in this virtual discussion room, we share, encourage, and challenge each other. Our friend Bill Hall is traveling this week, and we look forward to his return. So we have a very special guest getting our little team back to four. More on that in a moment. Here are the folks joining us in today's discussion.
Charles Willard.
Sara Mickelson in Tampa.
And I'm Katherine Kerr in Charlotte, North Carolina.
I'm Don Upton. I'm also in Charlotte, North Carolina today. And Katherine Kerr, thank you for joining us. I've been looking forward to having you part of this discussion all week. Katherine Kerr graduated from Davidson, and she's worked for a nonprofit before getting her master's in counseling from Wake Forest. She was a middle school counselor after that, went to Princeton Seminary, served a church in Mississippi before returning to Charlotte, was an associate at First Presbyterian in Charlotte for 12 years, and Katherine is now serving at Covenant Presbyterian as the Senior Associate Minister for Pastoral Care and Congregational Life. And we say, happy to have you here, Katherine, and welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be with you. It's I'm looking forward to a lively discussion.
Well,
after that.
We're looking forward to it too as well. And to help with that, Charles Willard is on point this week. Thank you, Charles. You're getting us ready for the Trinity Sunday, June 12th Gospel Lectionary. How are you, my friend?
I'm super duper, ready to go.
It's all yours.
Well, let me begin by reading the text that we have today, which is John chapter 16, verses 12 to 15. I want to say that I'm reading from something that is new in the world of biblical studies, because we have a new version of the Revised Standard Version, and this one is now called the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition. The nice thing about it from your point of view, even though it has, well, this whole work has a total of 20,000 total changes in the text of the Bible, only 12,000 are described by the editors as being substantial. So we've got 12,000 substantial changes and 20,000 total changes in the Bible that is now being circulated and populated since a couple of months ago, about a month ago. And the nice thing for you is that although I'm reading from a text that I'm looking at that I transcribed from the older version, there's no change in the part that you're looking at. In fact, you'll look hard and fast before you can find a change that actually looks like a change because of the way it was done. But that's so. I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version, updated edition, even though it is also the New Revised Standard Version, period. John chapter 16, verses 12 to 15. But I still have many things to say to you, but you cannot bear them now. When the Spirit of truth comes, he will guide you into all the truth, for he will not speak on his own, but will speak wherever he hears, and he will declare to you the things that are to come. He will glorify me, because he will take what is mine and declare it to you. All that the Father has is mine, and for this reason I said that he will take what is mine and declare it to you. That ends the gospel reading for this morning.
Thank you. Thanks be to God.
I circulated several questions that I thought we could take up today that would be let us expand on this text, and I in what my guests, y'all out there and y'all up further away, are now recognizing is I've simply changed those questions. Now I've got to find those questions. Okie dokie. What did he do with them, Charles? They are here, he said, hopefully. That's what happens when you have a desk that's covered like this with papers. You got to make sure you get the papers that are the ones you need in order to be able to ask the questions you need to ask. Okie dokie. Somebody sending me a message. Is the message the answers?
I have the questions if you want me to read them.
Yes. Why don't you read all three questions, and then we'll start at the top.
Terrific. Question number 1. Sarah's first question last week, with the deaths at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas, unraveling all of us, was, how do you hear these words in this time after this week? A week later, do we recall those words any differently? Question number 2. The 4 verses we have today do not include the Paraclete. However, they do sketch the complex but comprehensive interrelationship among Jesus, the Father, and the Spirit of Truth. If we let our imaginations open widely, what are some truths we might experience? Question number 3 that I understand is subject to change. Paul Knitter, professor at Union Theological Seminary, wrote, "Without Buddha, I could not be a Christian. Is this possible?" And those
Thank you very much, sir. Yes, I finally found the pieces of paper that I had, which will help, I think. What about the events that were barely behind where we started last week? And it was, to say demoralized, it would be an understatement of the sense of mystery, the sense of distress, the sense of unconsciousness of where we are. Sarah, since you started out the first one, the one to which I referred, and let me ask you then, how do you hear these words in this time after this week? A week later, do we recall these words any differently?
There have been 33 mass shootings since Uvalde. In the last week, 33 mass shootings since Uvalde. I hear these words differently only because I've lived with them now. I process them now for a week. And I think that's the part that helps me hear them as words of comfort and words of strength. It gave me time to consider, it gave me time to process and to resolve to action and to begin taking steps that I felt compelled to take because of how disassociated I felt and disheartened I felt after last week's events. And the fact that they've continued on a daily basis since then, or at least my awareness of them, maybe that's the hardest part of it, is my awareness of them has increased. And these words have given me a stronger resolve. A
stronger resolve to do what?
To take action, to be a part of what I feel compelled, the direction I feel compelled to move. And that is, I would say, to become more engaged in the political process and make phone calls, sometimes more than once a day, to my elected officials to say, I'm concerned about this particular crisis. I think it's a health crisis that we're experiencing. And the root of it is we don't even have the ability to study scientifically the impacts of gun violence on our country because that's prohibited. I'm like, that's bonkers to me. So I'm taking action because it's the natural recourse I have for feeling helpless. Does that answer your question, Charles?
It answers my question. It worries me. It worries me because of my own personal situation. I'm undergoing a transition up here in Minnesota where we moved, and what I'm trying to do is to find how to be a better husband for my wife, who is she's classified as being in assisted living. She is in assisted living, except that we're living together. And it was one of the reasons, there were other reasons, but that was highlighted when we moved here and has continued to this. We moved here 2 years, we moved to Minnesota 2 years ago from Florida, and we are now, after a year in the place where we were here for the first year, where I found that we were living in a community that was run by an executive director who had no compassion and no empathy, and was managed by a head nurse who had no compassion and no empathy, and was supported and by the director of, the sales manager, who had no compassion and no empathy. And that simply was unacceptable. There were some other things that happened, but a year later we moved. And I am, for the first time, I think, in my life, we've been married now for almost 60 years, and I'm finally finding out what it means to be a husband to a wife in a very interdependent way that hadn't been the case before. And this has been stunning for me. As I experience what that requires, that I had simply blithely assumed for the preceding 60 years almost. So it's stressful, and these other things, their stress level for me is a different kind. Y'all go out all the time. I don't go, I can't remember the last time I went outside and walked around the outside of the building, even though it's not cold anymore. We just stay inside. So how I think about your situation, where you, Sarah, for example, you described, what you do, and it doesn't happen here.
But you've experienced something very similar to that, Charles, in that you have taken action in the thing that you feel stress about. Mm-hmm.
That's true, but it's very. I'm not sure how John can be blamed for the way I'm behaving. What it means is that I recognize that I have been operating on a completely independent, self-centered life, and without having a dialogue about it, just assumed that my wife did the same thing, and she managed in a variety of ways to survive that independent way of functioning, but that those options aren't available to her anymore, and for me to pick them up is what's different.
You know what's so fascinating to me about this scripture and about the two very different experiences that you're talking about a national crisis and a relational crisis, which is what it sounds like for you, Charles. It's a personal and interpersonal, a massive change in your life. What has stuck with me in this passage as I've lived with it for several days is in the first verse, I have many things to say to you, but you cannot bear them now. And I feel like over and over and over throughout my life, what has been so comforting to me is this idea that through Jesus and through the Spirit, God understands what we can bear and what we can't bear. And this idea that the God who is greater than all of us understands that we go through times in our lives where we don't understand what's going on and we can't handle the fullness of the challenge of human life. And there's such an empathy and a compassion in that just gives me so much comfort in the face of really hard things like what we're facing as a nation. And Charles, what you're facing in your own life and what each of us face in our own life, that our God has a compassion for us that is expansive beyond anything we could imagine, to the point that in his incarnate form would say, I have so much to tell you, but you can't handle it all. And so I'm going to give you what you can handle. How beautiful is that?
Thank you. I agree.
I was looking at the Mark Davis translation and how he deals with the bearing it. And I may have this wrong, but I recall it having to do with lifting something of weight, not having the strength to pick it up. Mm-hmm. And it just broke open for me, because I was thinking about even the concept of what he's talking about, the concept of the paraclete, the forward-looking, the future thinking that's involved in this is just so interesting. And Charles, you're talking about, a period of 60 years, and it's interesting. John is probably 60 years out, something like that, in terms of what's being documented here. And your question, Charles, was about time. In this case, days, weeks after a tragedy, and the story is still being told and filled in. I just feel this conflict because the story's not told. Who am I? Who am I to make any assumption about this? I have empathy, but who am I as the story is told more and more and more and more memories, even in just a matter of days, builds out, and there's this future thinking in it. And with the book of John and the role of the Paraclete, there's this sense, and you have to put it in the entire book of John, that things don't necessarily fade. Things are not locked in time. Katherine, we talk a lot about women going to the tomb in all the Gospels and what they're trying to do. And I always view it as they're trying to lock Jesus in time, memorialize him, write him in stone, and they can't hold to him. They can't be done. And I think the Paraclete and this message, what we can't lift right in the Scripture, we can't lift it and understand it now, is all that ability to change and to continue to hear how the Spirit provides the sense-making going forward is this future thinking. I know we're counseled to consider the day, but in this piece, there's this future thinking and the patience of listening. And what I'll just say is this, I think, healthy ridicule of thoughts and prayers, which is more about locking in time and leaping to conclusion. This has got a real, for me this week, a special energy. Well, that's what I've been thinking about, Charles.
Wow.
Next question,
well, yeah, I can get to the next question. I just wanted to say how much I appreciate the way that the Lord manages to manage these things. He does it in a way that, or he, she, them, they do it in a way that works out. And I had no idea we were going to get to this point when we started out, but that's what I'm discovering in my life here in these conversations with you is that it doesn't always start or get to the middle or end in a way that we would have thought or planned at the beginning, and yet the Lord does manage these human crises that we have in a way that works for not only the crisis, whatever the subject of the crisis would be, but it works for all of us. That's the whole point. All right, second question. The 4 verses we have today do not include the Paraclete. However, they do sketch the complex but comprehensive interrelationship among Jesus, the Father, and the Spirit of truth, as he's named at one point. We let our imaginations open widely. What are some other truths might we experience? Let's see. Why not we go to, where did I write that one down? Katherine, it's up to you. What are some truths that we might experience? Other truths.
Well, that is quite a broad question. I state it from the standpoint of this passage, as well as just what we are navigating, again, right now as a country. I think, when I think about truth from the perspective of our faith, I go back to this idea that we want facts and we want verifiable things, and that faith asks us to look beyond that and to understand that truth is it's not always fact. It's not always something we can grab onto to say, for example, the stories in Scripture, we want to be able to point to them and say, did that actually happen? And interestingly enough, I am just about 2 weeks back from a trip to the Holy Land, and one of the things that happened over and over as we toured the different sites where Jesus was, our tour guide would say to us every time, now we're going to go to the place where they believe that Mary was born, and we're going to go to the place near where Jesus was born, Jesus was crucified. Can I tell you that this is the exact spot? No, I cannot. And I was so taken with the fact that this tour guide was so clear in the fact that when people come there, they want someone to tell them, this is exactly where this happened. This is exactly where Jesus multiplied the loaves and fishes. This is the spot where Jesus stood to deliver the Sermon on the Mount. And the truth is, no one can say that. From 2,000 years, we've lost the exact spot. But it struck me as to how human that desire is to grab onto something. I want to know exactly where Jesus stood so that I can be sure about my faith, when faith actually calls us to embrace the truth without having verifiable fact in front of us. There's plenty of archaeological evidence. There's plenty of certainty that the general area is where Jesus was. But what is this human desire to say, this is the spot, this is the thing, this is the undeniable truth? I'm interested in the broader truth, and this passage to me gives the broader truth. God in 3 persons, Blessed Trinity, is with us in all things, even and especially those things that we cannot understand. Starting with the Trinity itself, we can't nail that down. So why do we think we can nail down so many other things?
Don?
Thank you. And for the record, Charles Willard asked us to use our imaginations.
I know. I was so excited.
So I want to let this to soak in. This is exciting. I just made a few notes on this. I really appreciate that question. And the first thing that I was thinking about is just a reminder, what is it to walk at each other's side? That I think there's a way to understand what the Paraclete's doing by what we can do for each other. That there's the analogy Jesus uses, common metaphors about being at each other's side. So I think we can demonstrate that. We can understand it with a prayer, or what it is to support each other and be at each other's side at all stages of life. I mean, I've got a really simple example. I was with my granddaughters over the weekend, and I put a towel over my head. Ha ha. And the one who's almost 3, she thought it was hilarious, and I made a face. The other one was terrified. She's a little under 1. Didn't understand. And so my older granddaughter said, why is she frightened? Why is she scared? Now think about the 3 of us sitting there. Well, I was having a good time. I wasn't looking at the little one. I was looking at the 3-year-old, laughing. Well, when I finally looked over the other, the look on the face, you can imagine. What is the strangeness here? But I'm explaining to the older one. I said, she's never seen this before. That's all. It's new. It's new. And she goes, and she goes, well, that's a towel over his head. And she started explaining. I says, that's your job. We help each other. You've seen me do that before, haven't you? Yes, I have. Well, she hasn't. It's something new. And it's that simple, as we have multiple generations there explaining the fact that I put a towel over my head. And it mattered. Right? It mattered. And it set the tone for the 3-year-old in terms of watching and listening. So for me, Charles, I'm getting out of this is those basic questions for each other. And Katherine, you're trained as a counselor. What are you doing? What happened to you? Where are you going? What are you thinking about? And with Jesus, especially in Luke, which is not the subject today, he's always saying, I know what you're thinking. I know what's on your mind. That's the one thing we probably can't do for each other. For us, it's don't assume you know anything. You can ask. You can let stories be told. Stand back, let it happen, understand. But Jesus could also say, I know what's on your mind. So let's talk about that. So, Charles, you set this up. Today's discussion is we're a couple weeks out from a terrible tragedy. We know it's tragedy. We know what is on each other's mind, but it hasn't been played out. I'm loving how that is so now and so future. John was written dozens of years afterwards, and here we are 2,000 years later. Someone chose to curate all of this, but there's so much more. John's always like, there's more. There's so much that hasn't been told here. He chose to curate. This is all brought together, and we're, I think, charged with being curators as well, to be discerning about what we get right. And for me, the real truth that's coming to me is don't assume. I don't know. Charles always counseled us. We don't know exactly what people understood or what was said 2,000 years ago. I don't know how someone feels today. I can empathize. I can ask questions. But we're all in the business of sense-making. With the Spirit at our sides. Even when a grandfather puts a towel over his head, it's my job to help everybody make sense of what was going on. So the Paraclete, I guess that's for the Father, out of chaos, the chaos of the towel over her head, the chaos of what the news is, the chaos of not having all the data, is the Creator, the Eternal. John begins with the Eternal. In the beginning was the Word. And then for Jesus, the blood, and I just mean the sacrifice. I mean a beating heart and the weight of gravity, and a person walking, moving, and walking and moving through time, a human being. And then finally the Spirit, which I think for me today is more about storytelling and me being not knowing at all, not being orthodox, not being fundamental, but just saying, what? Tell me more. What is happening? Tell me, and filling in the pieces. And we all are charged with filling in those gaps with a prayer and with the Spirit walking at our side. So that was coming to mind for me, Charles.
Well, I'll throw in that I was drawn to the words that are lifted up in the Scripture. And so my truth became guide, repeat, represent, declare. A repeater or fire, and we've talked about that before, how that works in networks and how that works in radio towers and how that works in our households. So a repeater or an amplifier for Jesus' presence. In the first world, we have something called instant gratification. And we have purveyors of these instant gratifications, things like Uber Eats, DoorDash, Instacart, Amazon, Google, and they strive to stage and provide just-in-time goods and services. And we find in these verses a bold and modern presentation of just-in-time guidance when we need it, just-in-time remembrance when we need it, just-in-time presence and comfort when we need it. I think I find in this language, if you build it, I will come presence. Sorry to plagiarize Field of Dreams, but I think that's part of the challenge for me is the Spirit steps into my space where I am, where my headspace is, and what I'm capable of understanding, and gives me a message, a remembrance, or even just a presence of Jesus at that moment, where either I'm deeply unsettled, or I'm deeply questioning, or I'm deeply struggling, and I get this sense of it's going to be okay. We'll find a path. Or here's the next step. That's all you need right now. Here's the next step. Because it may not be okay. It may just be, here's your next step. But that's what I hear in these truths. And thank you for letting my imagination run wild.
Y'all are doing a great job. Thank you. But it's not the end. It's not the end. I've decided I'm not going to try to explore Paul Nitter's book. Without Buddha, I could not be a Christian. It is a good book and a remarkable piece of work. I want to ask you to take a look at our work in these 4 Gospels and to recognize that not only was John the last of the 4 that was written, it was written way after the others. It was written and to remind us that the 4 Gospels, although they come at the beginning of the New Testament because that's the way it was lined up, but in fact the way that it actually occurred was that the Pauline epistles were the ones that were written first at the very beginning, and this one that we are working on today was only written way toward the end of the first century, years after the others, years after the events themselves occurred, years after Jesus lived and died and was resurrected. And my question that I want you to explore with me is, why might somebody like John felt called upon to write this since all this other work had been done? Paul's letters had already been written. The 3 other Gospels had all been written, all related to each other, dependent upon each other in a variety of ways. And John comes along at the very end, especially after the other 3 Gospels have been written. Why wasn't that enough? What is it that John was thinking that he was doing in adding to what the others had already done, and to do it in a different way? And I want to suggest that John's approach is completely different from the way that the other 3 Gospels were written. And one way to think about that is that, let me see if I can get this right now, that, because I'm not looking at what I didn't write down something I could look at and just read it off and say, here it is, gobble it up. There are 2 ways of making a presentation. And the one would be, which is what the Gospels, the other three Gospels represent, would be, let me get this right now. I'm sorry. Take a minute. In the Gospel of John, we have what would be called an objective genitive, I think. And in the Gospel, the other three Gospels, it would be subjective genitives. No, it's the other way around. The Gospel of John is a subjective genitive, so it would be, that's why it starts out I, almost all the way through. And the other Gospels are he. So they're talking about Jesus. The Gospel of John is representing Jesus as being speaking directly, and it may be that's the reason that John was moved to do what he did after so long a time of this being, that they didn't get it quite right, in the sense that they didn't present it quite right. So that John presents Jesus as speaking, I am, and the others, Jesus is speaking, here it is. And I guess my question is, after that sort of stumbling description, do you sense that makes a difference or not? And do you hear anything different? Is John trying to persuade the readers that this is worth being different, even though each of the three was written and actually quite dependent upon each other? Mark, and then was used by both Luke and Matthew, but in different ways. And they were all related to each other, but that's why the so-called synoptic gospels go together, and John is like the stranger independently. But it's in the first person. I. Does that make a difference to anybody?
I think it does.
Speak.
Well, there's a huge difference between being the good news or telling us the good news. One's a living example. The other one is yet another photographic evidence of what it looked like to see the good news. And so I think that's kind of the difference between a breathing narrative that invites the reader in. For me, the book of John has always been the one that captured me. The others were kind of narratives that I could follow along. But the book of John invited me to step closer, if that's the case, because of how it was written. A living good news, a living path, a process by which I could echo and become someone that walked the path better. That's just my take on it.
I have a very similar experience, Sarah, and the way I've often thought of it is I think of the synoptic gospels as kind of the structure and the framework, and John is the living, moving piece that animates it. And so it in some ways, the way I understand the Spirit in our lives, John, the poetry of John, the personal feel of it, the synoptics give us the structure and the story, which we need desperately. And John fills in with the animating voice of Christ. And I've always loved it for that reason. And I think it does make sense that this comes later, that, people had the facts and the reality as they understood it in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And then John is this, okay, you may have heard the story, and here's Christ's voice and an understanding of the Word that became flesh, that here's a piece of it that we need to understand in order to live more fully in faith.
Thank you.
And I think so. There was a sense of a need at that point down the road. And I mean this in a really healthy way, and in the spirit of the passage today. Some things need to be tidied up, tied together. Isn't that always the case? I could go back and read something I wrote down 5 years ago and go, who already reads that? Because that's not tidy. I think there's a lot of future thinking in this, that we are tidying up as we go. We need to help each other, walk beside each other. We need to paraclete to help tidy it up because it's heavy. Can't bear this. It's tough. And so there's a retrospective, and this is part of the tidying up is, we need to add the cosmic in the beginning. Let's start this one and set it in terms of the eternal first. Let's do that. And then we get to these passages at the end, part of the tidying up. I think we've got like Philip just a week ago or 2 weeks ago going, well, if you'll just make it clear to us now, please, we'll be fine. Everything's going to be okay. And this book goes, that's not the way it works. It winds out. We'll be here, we'll be there. And I think last week we talked about Katherine, 50 years from now, whether we like it or not, this podcast will be around.
Yes.
Oh, my.
And people will be saying, what were they thinking?
What were they thinking? Hear Charles's voice. But it will. It will. So part of it is, we take a deep breath before we do this. And, I'm not saying my voice has any value 50 years from now, but knowing it would be out there, what kind of tidying up is needed? Well, I depend on my granddaughter 50 years from now to say, well, look at the picture of my grandfather. He's long past, but don't be afraid. It's just a towel on his head. He wasn't a scary person at all. I mean, we're doing that for each other. And I think this book is of tidying up is saying, look forward, look forward, look forward. I'm giving you the cosmic. I'm giving you the past. This is forward. So I'd say, in summary, Charles, this passage is the answer to your question. This particular short passage, this Trinitarian view, which is who is God? Who is Jesus? What is the Spirit? How do we bear up? How do we understand? How do we help each other? I think the answer is actually the four verses that we had today. How about you, Charles?
Well, I want to say in conclusion, at least conclusion for the part that I wanted to add, is that I finally recognized, well, it's not that this is the first time I'd seen it, but it's not a matter of either or. It's not a matter of the synoptics got it right, and
And
this one came along later. It's both and that's the nice part about being able to at this distance to see the two instead of having to deal with one or three, and then in our case we get both.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost as if the synoptics bring us a two-dimensional impression, and then John steps into the picture and we get 3 dimensions. And there's just a difference in animation. When you move from a 2D screen to a 3D presentation, it moves from being something so foreign that we can go, that's not us, into something that becomes so much like us, we can go, I recognize myself now. And I think there's some loveliness in moving it from 2 dimensions into 3 dimensions and giving us space to move into the story. And for me, that I think you're right, Charles. It's both and.
And the beauty is that God gives us this complexity instead of just saying, here's the story. I have it. Here it is in one way. This is it. This is all you need to know. And, you know, I often say that. I mean, we think it would be easier if what we had was maybe a pamphlet from God that said, here are the key points, here are the cliff notes, this is what you have to do, and when this happens, do this, and when this happens, do this. And life is not like that, and that's not how God interacts with us. God interacts with us in a complex way that's also quite simple, that it boils down to, I am God, you are humans, you are beloved, follow me, love one another. But we know when we live that out, it's complicated, and Scripture bears that out, right? And I mean, here are lots of different ways to understand it, live into it to the best of your ability.
Well, Charles, thank you for leading us this week. It's just great to have you on point. Thank you. Thank you for joining our little family. It's great to have you with us today. Sara, always a pleasure to see and hear you. And for folks listening in, Palmacia Presbyterian Church is at 3501 West San Jose Street. That's in Tampa, Florida. They make this program possible. And for more information, you can go to palmacia.org. That's PALMACEIA.org. And we commend that site to you because there's great prayers, sermons, differences of opinion on Scripture, a chance to take communion, outstanding music. So check that out. And you're always welcome, and we'll see you next time.